A courtroom buzzes with uneasy whispers as a tall black man in a crisp suit steps forward. Shackled at the wrists, the arresting officer smirks from across the aisle, certain he's about to witness this suspect's downfall. But the moment the judge glances at the paperwork, the officer's smug grin fades. Instant dread replaces his confidence. An electrified hush grips the room, leaving everyone on edge about who this man truly is. Sometimes. Time earlier, Leon Davis began his morning in a modest suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where most people nod hello, but keep to themselves a tall African-American man in his mid-50s. Leon carried himself with a quiet confidence. He was on his way to the courthouse at sunrise, briefcase in hand, when he noticed a distressed elderly woman struggling to lift her grocery bags onto a public bus bench. Without hesitation, Leon placed his own items down, stepped forward, and gently took the weight out of her trembling arms. "Thank you, son," she whispered in relief. Her eyes glistening with gratitude, Leon felt a small surge of warmth in his chest. Even these minor acts of kindness reminded him why he valued community and decency. Just as he finished assisting her, a police cruiser rolled by. Leon paid little attention. At first he had no reason to be concerned, yet the cruiser slowed to a crawl, the driver glaring at him with an intensity he couldn't ignore. Leon adjusted his suit jacket, trying to appear calm, but he sensed something was off. The officer, a white man in his 30s, wore a hardened expression that suggested he had already decided Leon was a threat before even rolling down the window. Moments later the car stopped, and the officer stepped out, hand resting on his holster. "You there? Hold up." He barked Vo, echoing through the early morning. Stillness. Passers-by shot nervous glances but hurried on, not wanting to get involved. Leon blinked, trying to steady his pulse. He wasn't breaking any law. He simply stood there, mind racing. "This is ridiculous," he thought, swallowing a flash of anger. "I've done nothing wrong. Just help the neighbor." The officer strode toward him, demanding to see identification. Despite Leon's polite compliance, the cop seemed determined to escalate. He threw out thinly veiled accusations, suspicious activity, loitering, potential theft. None of it made sense, but Leon recognized them all too well. He knew the language of racial profiling. In the span of a few tense minutes, the situation escalated. The elderly woman tried to speak up in Leon's defense, but the officer cut her off. "Ma'am, step aside." He snapped, "I'm handling this." Leon tried to keep his composure, but he felt the sting of anger welling up. People around them paused to watch. Their stares carried a mix of fear and curiosity, forming a makeshift audience to his humiliation. Just stay calm. He told himself it'll all be sorted out. Yet the officer had already decided that Lon must be hiding something. The man reached for his cuffs, ordering Leon to turn around in a surreal moment. Leon found himself pinned against the side of the cruiser, his arm twisted in a way that sent sharp pain through his shoulder. The morning air grew colder somehow, as if even the wind recoiled at the injustice. Despite wanting to protest, Leon held his tongue. Years of dealing with subtle and overt discrimination had taught him that his best weapon was self-control. Still, humiliation see through him like a slow burn. This was far beyond a simple misunderstanding. What happened next changed everything you won't want to miss. How it all unfolds, having endured the public spectacle of being handcuffed on the street. Leon was taken straight to the police station. There, he was unceremoniously seated on a hard wooden bench, the metal cuffs cutting into his wrists. The officer who detained him paced around like he owned the place, rattling off statements about people who think they can ignore the law. Leon tried to explain his situation. He was on his way to the courthouse for an important meeting, but the officer merely scoffed. "Yeah, sure, and I'm the president." The cop sneered, flinging Leon's briefcase onto a nearby desk, its contents mostly neatly organized documents spilled across the surface. Leon bristled but forced himself to remain collected. A storm of thoughts swirled. Is this happening because I'm black? Is this officer on some power trip? How far will he take? His frustration was tinged with dark humor. A sarcastic voice in his head, wondering what the officer would say if he discovered Leon's real identity. Soon, a second officer joined in a stocky, older man who seemed less hostile but no more sympathetic together. They photographed Leon, fingerprinted him, and took his personal information. The booking process was humiliating. Drawn out by their obvious suspicion, every question felt like an accusation. And Leon knew they saw him not as a man who'd done a good deed that morning, but as a criminal who needed to be put in his place. Word of the arrest spread among the station staff, and a few curious onlookers peered around corners. Whispering Leon caught fragments of conversation must have done something real bad, or he's too dressed up. Probably laundering money. The assumptions were laughable if they weren't so infuriating. His requests for a phone call went ignored for hours by the time the officer grudgingly brought him to the holding cell. Leon's body was aching from tension, yet in the midst of it all he found a steadfast resolve. He reminded himself of the people who depended on him to stand firm. They'll see soon enough. He thought a flicker of determination sparking in his chest. Later that day he was informed he'd be facing a judge the next morning. Standard procedure, they said. The arresting officer made a point of smirking, as though he couldn't wait for Leon to face the full weight of the law with an unmistakable air of arrogance. He muttered under his breath, "Let's see how tough you are in court." Leon kept his composure, meeting the officer's gaze without flinching. He'd spent his life dealing with this kind of prejudice, but rarely so blatant or personally targeted. Part of him wanted to shout the truth, to wipe that smug grin off the man's face. But he knew timing was everything. Patience had always been his strength today. More than ever, he was prepared. This was the turning point. Everything you've been waiting for is right here, so stay tuned to see how our hero sets everyone in their place. Too slowly, Leon, still exhausted from a sleepless night on a cold cell bench, was let out in handcuffs, escorted into the courthouse like a dangerous offender. His mind was a swirl of pent-up anger, disbelief, and a hint of satisfaction. He knew what awaited in that courtroom, and the officer clearly did not. The room hummed with low chatter. As Leon entered, a few courtroom staffers recognized him, eyes widening at the sight of him in custody. They exchanged glances but said nothing, perhaps out of fear of crossing the resting cop. The officer himself stood by arms, folded, an overconfident grin still plastered to his face. The judge took her seat, calling the room to order. Leon felt the quiet hush settle over the benches. When his case was finally announced, the hush shattered into shocked whispers. The charges read out loud: resisting arrest. Suspicious behavior sounded as thin as tissue paper to anyone who knew Lon's reputation. But the real thunderclap came when the judge acknowledged who Leon truly was: the newly appointed state's chief prosecutor. A wave of disbelief swept through the room. The officer's face drained of color so abruptly it looked like he might faint in one moment. His bravado vanished, replaced by sheer panic. He stole a glance at Leon, suddenly realizing the weight of his colossal mistake. Leon held his head high, the dignity he'd fought to maintain finally paying off as he calmly addressed the court. He recounted the absurd chain of events, his voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from outrage, mixed with vindication. Witness statements and surveillance footage confirmed his innocence. The judge, appalled by the blatant misuse of authority, demanded an inquiry into the officer's conduct. Murmurs rippled through the spectators, for all the officers Swagger he now stood there, SWW in his eyes, darting about in desperation, attempting an apology. He stammered excuses that seemed childish in the face of the days, revelations the judge offered him no sympathy, making it clear that disciplinary actions were imminent. Finally free of the cuffs, Leon walked out a few steps ahead of the officer, his personal items returned, and his head held even higher than before. Outside, a small cluster of onlookers gathered, some outraged on his behalf, others simply stunned by the twist. Leon took a deep breath of fresh air, letting the morning sun warm his face. He could have gloated or lashed out in that moment, but instead he merely gave a calm nod. He thought about the countless people who never got a chance to fight back against injustice, who bore the brunt of harassment and bias without the protection of influence. Today's outcome was a victory, one that he hoped would echo beyond the courthouse walls, reminding everyone that prejudice can and will be exposed. He walked down the courthouse steps, not just as a man who had cleared his own name, but as someone more determined than ever to hold racially biased actions accountable under the law. Justice in its truest sense had prevailed, and for Leon Davis that was reason enough to keep moving forward, ready to confront the next challenge with unwavering resolve.